Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Nick and today we got a banger of a video for you guys, one that I'm super excited to share with you. Not only because this is easily the biggest video that I've ever made for this channel, bigger than the tournaments, bigger than the tier list, anything that has to do with this amount of research and prep, you know is going to be a good time. And today we are making a follow-up to the previous video I posted called Popularity versus Fans, a video commentary. Now, if you have not seen it, I do recommend checking it out before you jump into this one, but in case you have not, here is a quick summary. The relationship between what is popular in the world of music and movies and what fans actually enjoy are very, very complicated. And the majority of the time, it seems as though that fans often desire things that are more underground, more independent, less popular than the biggest commercial successes in those two categories. For example, times when the highest grossing movie of a certain genre is not always the one that fans absolutely love compared to some of the smaller ones, or the top Spotify artists not being fan favorites in most cases. The exception to this rule, however, is when it comes to TV. A lot of the time, the most popular and most critically acclaimed shows, such as How I Met Your Mother, Breaking Bad, or The Simpsons, are often the most popular both for critics and fans, as well as just being the most beloved shows of all time. Now, in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to put that theory to the test with an extensive research project. And what that means is we're going to take a bunch of different TV shows, these 50 that you see scrolling by here, and we're going to put them through a series of tests to measure their popularity, their critic scores, and their fan favorite scores. By the end, we will have a definitive conclusion if the theory holds any weight. Now, to do this, what we have to do is we have to perform a series of tests to measure the different categories. We're going to start with popularity, and for that, we needed these three factors. Number one was their IMDb user review score. This is a measure of how many people have reviewed the show in question on IMDb and how many people are actively watching it. Secondly was its graph on Google Trends. If you're not familiar, Google Trends is a fantastic resource to check the popularity of different search results on Google across the web. And what it measures is how many people are actively looking up for the show, and you can compare it to other shows and other items by similar search results. It's a very, very helpful resource for this project. And number three was its Nielsen rank. This is probably the most commonly cited source that most people use in order to declare a show's popularity of being really high or really low, depending on the circumstance. And for us, what we wanted was to see this measure because it's a good way to gauge how many people watched it when it first aired, as well as its definitive legacy within the TV sphere. For every test that we go throughout this video, I'm going to rank all of the shows from top to bottom, and they'll scroll by as we talk about them. And I'm going to highlight some of the most important shows, the top 5, the bottom 5, as well as anything else that stood out within the ranking for each test. With that said, let's get this started with our IMDb user review score. Now, this was a very simple test to conduct. All we had to do was rank all of the shows from highest to lowest depending on the score in question. Now, in this case, what we had was this number here, as you can see highlighted, which is the number of reviews that the show has on IMDb. Coming in number one in this category was Friends with well over 800,000 reviews. That was the most of any of the shows that we tested, and by far one of the highest on IMDb as a whole. Number two was The Big Bang Theory with over 700,000 this time, and rounding out our top three was How I Met Your Mother with 600,000. The Office scored at number 4 with 409, and rounding out the top 5 was The Simpsons with 363,000 reviews. On the opposite end, we had these bottom 5. Number 46 was The Drew Carey Show with only 16,000 reviews. Number 47 was the Ted Danson-led Becker with 11,000. Number 48 was The Neighborhood with 4,300, so just under 5,000 reviews at this point. Number 49 was Aliens in America with 3,400. And finally, coming in dead last in this category with a whopping 53 reviews, less than 100 total reviews, was Can't Hurry Love. Now, these bottom two shows aren't really that surprising to see ranked as low as they did, simply because they are only on for a single season, and most people don't really remember them. They're pretty obscure, so it makes sense that these would rank last in this category. As for our top 5, those are all pretty accurate as well. I think there's not really any major surprises here, and the rest of the list, as you've been seeing here, is pretty reflective of that. There's not really anything important to highlight here. This is a pretty straightforward test. Let's move on to Google Trends, the second of our popularity test. This graph right here represents the top 5 shows we had in this test after days and days of research. Those being The Office at number 1, Friends at number 2, The Simpsons at number 3, Family Guy at number 4, and The Big Bang Theory at number 5. Now, this graph represents the bottom 5, as you can see, and those were in order: The Drew Carey Show, According to Jim, Becker, Aliens in America, and Can't Hurry Love coming in last once again. Now, this graph here, which is the most interesting of the 3 if you ask me, is a good representation of the different layerings that we had. This graph is a representation of our top-rated show, which was The Office, our bottom-rated, which was Can't Hurry Love, and the one that came in at 25, so the most middle of the road, which happened to be Young Sheldon. And looking at this, you can see that clearly there is a clear, difference between the 3 as far as their popularity goes. None of these really touch. The Office is well above the other 2 there, not even coming close to Young Sheldon and second here. And comparably so, even though Young Sheldon does dip a little bit closer to the bottom where Can't Hurry Love is, it still manages to maintain itself relatively high, putting it in the middle of the pack here comparably. Finally, let's talk about the Nelson ranks for all of these shows. The Nelson ranks are extremely important for a lot of networks to determine what shows they want to renew and which ones they want to cancel. It's a measure of how many people actively watch the show week to week when new episodes air, but it also takes into account things like shows that are on streaming, if eligible. It takes things like people that record it on DVRs and then watch it later. It's a lot of different ways that people can watch the show, and the Nelson Company is by far the most accurate in determining how many people are actively watching. Now, for most people, when they cite Nelson ranks, they usually do it in how many millions of people watch individual episodes. And that's a really good measure for the companies to have, because it gives them an indication of which episodes are popular, if they need to adjust anything with the scripts or anything with the show itself, and to determine advertising. None of that really applies to us here. We just want to get a general measure of its popularity. So instead, what we're going to use is this number, which is usually just referred to as rank. This number represents is the rank the show had with each given TV season. Usually that's typical between the fall of one year and then the spring of the next. And these numbers usually come out around May or June at the end of any given TV season. We're going to use the Goldbergs here as an example so you can see how we perform this test and what the numbers here actually represent. As you can see here, each season is representative of a different rank that the show had for that given TV season. What we did was we took all of these, added them up, and then divided them by the number of seasons the show had. In addition to taking the average of the show's rank, we also took measures for its peak rating, its first season rating, and its final or most recent season, depending on the show. These were used to break any ties we may have had, and the order of the numbers here represent that. Going over our top 5, we had this order for this category. Number 1 went to The Cosby Show this time around with an average of 4, a peak at 1, and a first season rank of 3. Compare that to our number 2, which was Friends, had an average of 4, a peak of 1, and a first season of 8. So Cosby Show got the edge in that respect. Number 3 was Home Improvement, which had an average of 6 and a peak at number 2. Number 4 was Young Sheldon, which only had 3 seasons, but did really well for itself here, with an average of 7 and a peak of 5. Rounding out our top 5, we had The Big Bang Theory, appropriately enough, with an average of 13 and a peak at number 1. The Big Bang Theory in particular was a good example of a show that got gradually better the more it went on for. Its only real hiccup in this test was the very first season it had, which ranked at 68. And comparably, that is not really a great spot to be. Most networks usually want to get in the top 50 of a show, so anything that's 50 or above is usually where we want to be. In addition to this, The Big Bang Theory's peak season was season 11, which was its second to last one. So like I said, it got gradually better as it went on, and that's a good example of it. As for our bottom 5, we had a total of 9 shows that had an average of more than 100, and we had 2 shows that had a peak of more than 100, and these were our bottom 5 representing that. Number 46 was New Girl with an average of 115 and a peak of 66. Number 47 was Last Man on Earth with an average of 120 and a peak of 93. Aliens in America came in at 48, which was only a 1 season, so for its numbers here, it's 137 across the board. Number 49 was Bob's Burgers with an average of 140 and a peak of 96. And finally, coming in dead last in this category, which was super surprising to not only me, but my associates as well, was Everybody Hates Chris with an average of 158 and a peak of 120. What we found to be the most surprising with the Nielsen ranks specifically was this was by far the most unique that we had for the popularity test. It was the most important because this is, again, one of the most cited ways to determine popularity within TV, but it was also the most distinct of the 3 tests that we had performed. Big ranking shows from the first test that did really well somehow slipped in this one, and shows that didn't really do well beforehand actually did much better this time. I'll give you a few examples real quick. One of those being Becker and Can't Hurry Love, which ranked in the bottom 5 of the previous 2 tests, actually did really well this time, putting themselves in the top 15. We also found a strange correlation between shows that critics usually did not prefer and usually had in their bottom 10, but actually did very well this time, ranking in our top half. Some examples of that being The Neighborhood, Two Broke Girls, or Mike and Molly. Comparably, we had shows that ranked really high for critics, such as Parks and Rec and Brooklyn Nine-Nine, that ranked in our bottom 10 this time around for the Nielsen ranks. It just goes to show you that popularity is not always what it seems to be. At the end of our 3 popularity tests, we had these 3 come out on top in our category average. Those being Friends taking the number 1 spot, Big Bang Theory taking number 2, and Seinfeld taking number 3. Even though Seinfeld never cracked the top 5, it was able to stay consistent enough throughout the top 10 of each category to rank in our average top 3. As for our very bottom of the barrel show with popularity, that honor goes to Aliens in America. Let's move away from the popularity test and let's dive right into the critics. The critical consensus portion of the video concluded that 3 different websites were needed to help gauge the critical consensus of each of these shows. Those being IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, and Metacritic, 3 of the most commonly sorted for critics specifically. These tests were very easy to conduct, as all we had to do was look up the show on each one and rank them from highest to lowest depending on the scores we were provided with. This is the 1 to 50 rank for IMDb, which is the one we're going to start off with. Coming in at number 1 here was Friends with a very impressive 8.9 out of 10. Secondly was The Office, that also had an 8.9. If you're wondering how we settled ties here on IMDb, and for that we simply referred back to the user reviews. Shows with a higher user review score ranked higher in the critical consensus because we figured that more people sharing their opinion and it genuinely doing better was a better sign that the show was more well-liked with critics specifically. With that said, our next 2 shows also tied, those being Seinfeld at number 3 and Freaks and Geeks at number 4 with an 8.8 each respectively. And finally, coming in at number 5 here was The Simpsons with an 8.7. As for our bottom 5 on IMDb, those went in this order. Family Matters with a 6.6 at 46. According to Jim with a 6.4 at 47. Mike and Molly also with a 6.4 at 48. The Neighborhood with a 6.4 at 49. And ranking at number 50 for IMDb critics was The Cleveland Show with an appalling 5.5 out of 10. I think that was the lowest I'd ever seen for any show on IMDb was The Cleveland Show, and that just goes to show you that spinoffs just sometimes do not work. Moving over to Rotten Tomatoes, this was our 1 to 50 rank overall. Our top 5 went as followed. Freaks and Geeks with a perfect 100% score. Malcolm in the Middle also with a 100% score, ranking at number 2. For this one, we referred to the user reviews here, which gave us a measure of how well the fans particularly liked these shows on Rotten Tomatoes. And Freaks and Geeks just barely edged it out with a 97 compared to a 94 for Malcolm, which gave Freaks and Geeks the number 1 spot. The Good Place took home bronze here with a 97%. Brooklyn Nine-Nine took a 95, which gave it number 4. And coming in our top 5 as well was Everybody Hates Chris, making itself up from the Nelson ranks with a 95 as well. Full House was the first of our bottom 5 shows on Rotten Tomatoes with only a 40% rank on the website. Coming in at 47 was Can't Hurry Love with a 38%. 48 was Rules of Engagement with a 36%. 49 was The Neighborhood with only 24%. And coming in dead last on Rotten Tomatoes with a appalling 14% rank was According to Jim. That was the lowest ranked show on any of these tests, including the Metacritic one, which we'll talk about in just a second. And 14% would have been the equivalent to a 1.4 on IMDb, which would have been insanely low. Rotten Tomatoes was the most extreme of the 3 critic tests, with the top 2 shows, Freaks and Geeks and Malcolm, scoring perfect 100% scores, and our bottom of the barrel number 50 show, According to Jim, with a 14%, which was the lowest of any of the critic scores we saw. IMDb, on the other hand, was the most conservative with these, with their highest ranking shows only getting an 8.9, which was the lowest of any of the top tier shows, and their bottom of the barrel show, which was The Cleveland Show, only getting a 5.5, which was the highest of any of the lowest ranked. By comparison, Metacritic was somewhere in the middle. Its top 5 went as followed here. Cheers was number 1 with a 91%, which was really impressive because Metacritic rarely gives more than a 90, so that was really cool to see. Malcolm in the Middle scored at number 2 here with 88. Freaks and Geeks also had 88, and this time it came in 3rd. Its user reviews on Metacritic were slightly different, giving Malcolm the edge this time around, putting it in 2nd place. And our last 2 in the top 5 were Everybody Hates Chris, showing itself once again with an 87, and Modern Family jumping into a top 5 with an 87 as well. As for our bottom ranked shows on Metacritic, they went in this order. The Neighborhood with a 50 out of 100, ranked at 46. American Dad with a 43 out of 100, ranked at 47. According to Jim with a 42 out of 100, ranked at 48. Full House with a 31 out of 100, ranked at 49. And our last place show on Metacritic was Rules of Engagement with only a 28 out of 100. After our 3 critical tests were complete, we finally had enough to score an average rank on all 3, which happened to be Freaks and Geeks at number 1, scoring a number 1 spot on Rotten Tomatoes, which was its peak rating in this category. Number 2 was Malcolm in the Middle. And again, even though it didn't really crack the top 5 all that much, it was able to remain consistent throughout and score at number 2. And taking our last place on the podium here was The Good Place at number 3, where it scored a number 3 placement on Rotten Tomatoes, where it peaked. As for our lowest rated show, that honor goes to According to Jim with that abysmal 14% on Rotten Tomatoes, scoring in last place. Finally, it was time to look at the fan favorite portion. Now, this was the easiest test to conduct because I only had to do one of the three. I enlisted the help of my brother Matt and my buddy Mike, who are big fans of these sitcoms as well, and the three of us each individually made lists ranking all of the shows from best to worst in our opinion. I'm going to go over everyone's top and bottom five, give you the averages, and then we'll finally be able to see if our theory rings true. My number one was How I Met Your Mother, which should be no surprise to anybody because it is my all-time favorite show. Number two was Modern Family. Number three was Mike and Molly. Number four was Two Broke Girls. Told you it was a top five show. And number five was Family Guy. For my bottom five, I had it in this order. New Girl at 46, Everybody Loves Raymond at 47, According to Jim at 48, Young Sheldon at 49, and at number 50, my most hated show on the planet, The Drew Carey Show. For Mike, he also had How I Met Your Mother at number one, which is his favorite sitcom, but his top five looked very different from the rest of mine. That being at number two, The Office, at number three, That 70s Show, at number four, Family Matters, and at number five, The Big Bang Theory. His bottom five also was a little bit different as well, with number 46 going to Will and Grace, number 47 going to Becker, number 48 going to Can't Hurry Love, number 49 going to Aliens in America, and also having the same number 50 as me with The Drew Carey Show. Finally, Matt had the most unique top and bottom five going in this order. His number one went to Family Guy, of course, which again should be no surprise if you guys know him very well. Number two was That 70s Show. Number three was Mike and Molly. Number four was American Dad. And number five was Bob's Burgers. Lots of cartoons up there. Of course, for Matt, that makes sense. And his bottom five went as followed. 46 was According to Jim. 47 was New Girl. 48 was The King of Queens. 49 was The Cosby Show. And his last ranked show this time around was 30 Rock. With that out of the way, the averages for the fan favorite portion went as followed. How I Met Your Mother scored the number one here because of its two number one placements on me and Mike's list, and a top 10 placement for Matt. Number two was That 70s Show, again having two top three placements, peaking on Matt's list at number two, and on mine scoring in the top 10. And rounding out our top three, taking bronze, was Family Guy. It scored in the top 15 for Mike, in my top 5, and peaking at number 1 on Matt's list. As for our bottom of the barrel section, it was, of course, The Drew Carey Show, with two abysmal ratings, lowest it could possibly be for me and Mike's list, respectively. At the very end of all of these tests and all three categories giving their average, it was time to figure out which shows ranked at the top overall and which ones came crumbling down at the bottom of the barrel. The number one show ranked of all of these lists after all the averages were sorted out, doing all the math multiple times to double check, was a surprising victory for Modern Family of all shows. It ranked in the top 5 for each category overall, but it didn't manage to rank at number 1 for any of them individually, which was the biggest surprise that we had up until that point. In fact, none of the top number 1s for any of the category averages ranked in the top 5 overall. The rest of the top 5 went as followed. Seinfeld at number 2, The Good Place at 3, The Simpsons at 4, and Parks and Rec at 5. None of those shows took the number 1 in each individual category, and it was at this point that we realized that consistency was the key. Any fluke number 1 that any of these shows may have had certainly helped them in the long run, but it didn't sustain it enough to get it into the top 5. None of these shows ranked as number 1 at all, but they all managed to stay consistent enough within the top 10 to rank high up. That being said, where did the number 1s rank overall? Well, the number 1 for fans, How I Met Your Mother, was number 6, so it was very close, admittedly. The number 1 for popularity, which was Friends, ranked at number 10, and the number 1 for critics was Freaks and Geeks, that ranked at 12. As for our bottom of the barrel shows as a whole, the averages went as followed. Number 46 went to The Cleveland Show, number 47 went to Becker, number 48 went to Can't Hurry Love, number 49 went to The Drew Carey Show, and ranking in dead last overall for each of the categories was According to Jim, the worst rated sitcom that we tested during this video. Now, on the opposite end, what was very interesting was the lowest rated show for each category actually did manage to pop up here. Not all three, but two of the three did. Those being According to Jim for critics and The Drew Carey Show being for fans. For popularity, it was Aliens in America, which ended up ranking at 42. So it was in the bottom 10, which I couldn't say for the other ones because Freaks and Geeks for critics ranked outside of the top 10. At this point, we had our averages, and we had all of the data we needed to answer this question, which was if popular shows were also fan favorites. Now, the way that we wanted to test this out, to be as carefully and precise as we could, was to compare the top 10 and the bottom 10 of each of the categories to see what shows matched up and how many proportionally there were. Now, to do this, what we had was the averages for each three categories. We took the top 10 of each one and compared them to one another to see how many shows were in each one together. And this is what we found. When we took the top 10 averages for the fans and the critics, we found 40% matched up. 4 of the shows that we had on the top 10 of the fans also appeared in the top 10 for the critics. When it came to the critics and the popularity segments, that was only 30%, implying that critics have generally less consensus when it comes to what's popular compared to what fans and critics agree on, which was pretty interesting. And rounding out our top 10 tests were the fans and the popularity, the most important of all. This only scored us with 40%. There were only 4 shows that peaked in both the top 10 of the fans and the top 10 of popularity. So it wasn't that much more than fans and critics, which was a little surprising. There was only one show that came in the top 10 of every category as well, which was Modern Family, which was the show that ranked highest as a whole for the entire video. However, when we looked at the bottom 10, this is where we found our smoking gun, and the definitive answer to the question of what's popular is also fan favorites. And surprisingly enough, we found that it contradicted the theory altogether. When we took a look at the bottom 10 for fans and critics, it was only a 10% match. There was only one show that appeared in the bottom 10 for each of them, meaning that fans and critics heavily disagreed on which shows were bad. There were a lot of shows that fans defended, that we had high up on that list, that critics absolutely hated, and there were a lot of shows that fans could not stand that critics actually enjoyed. And when we took a look at the correlation between what critics had in their bottom 10 and the least popular shows, the bottom 10 for popularity, we found a 40% correlation. This surprised us a bit. This was really surprising. It meant that critics preferred shows that were more popular than those that weren't. In a strange twist of events, it seemed as though they were following the theory's rule more than fans were. And it was this number here, the correlation between fans' bottom 10 and the bottom 10 for popularity, that put this all into perspective. 20%. Only 2 shows appeared on both the bottom 10 for fans and the bottom 10 for popularity. This was our smoking gun. This alone proved our theory wrong. It's a weird ending to this theory because by design, you would expect that the unpopular shows would also be the fans' most disliked. But as it turns out, there were numerous shows, tons of shows, that didn't follow that rule, that were unpopular and obscure, but fans absolutely loved them. And by contrast, the shows that ended up on the bottom 10 of the fans were quite popular with general audiences, and critics for that matter. By that logic, it follows the same rules that movies and music do, which is the less popular something is, the more it's likely to have a large fandom. TV was proven to follow that rule to a T. Tons, thousands of shows out there that fans, critics, and are very popular, could all agree on were some of the best of all time. But by contrast, many shows that were unpopular or fell through the cracks lived on to see high fandoms. We saw this in our own test with shows like Freaks and Geeks, a show that was completely irrelevant when it first came out, completely unknown, but has since flourished into something much, much bigger because of a dedicated fan base. To give even more credence to this theory, though, let's take a look at the peaks. When we took our averages for the entire project and we ranked all the shows objectively from top to bottom, Modern Family at the top, according to Jim, at the bottom. We also took measures for what list they peaked on, what that rank was, if it was a number 1, 2, 3, etc., and where it came from. Our top 10 went as followed, with the peaks generally coming from what was popular, implying that popularity had the biggest influence on determining what shows overall were the best. This directly correlated with the bottom 10, where popularity only accounted for 10% of the peaks with the bottom 10 shows. If popularity was the definitive influence here, it would imply that fans were influenced by popularity, proving the theory right. However, that was quickly sunk with this one statistic. Fans taking 50% influence of the bottom 10. Out of the 10 shows that were down there, 5 of them, more than any other category, peaked on fans' lists. This was the smoking gun. This was the heart in the stone that gave us our answer. Officially, we could determine through analytics and through data that the TV theory was proven wrong. It was simply incorrect, and every medium followed the same exact pattern. Unpopular, obscure shows, unpopular, obscure albums, unpopular, obscure movies are much more likely to have homes in fans' hearts. By design, critics are less likely to think this way, and that was again proven here. Popularity does have influence, but not for all the right reasons sometimes, and you might personally disagree with any of these rankings. It's all very subjective here. If you don't believe Modern Family is the best of any of these shows, I completely understand. But through numerous weeks of testing, through numerous data points, the conclusion speaks for itself. To prove our theory wrong was heartbreaking, to say the least. It hurts to be wrong, and it hurts to publicly share that online, but this topic is so much more. There's so many finite details, there's so many small little influences beyond what we could measure here. If you have any other thoughts on this topic, please let me know in the comments. And if you want to see a follow-up to this video, let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. I want to thank everyone for watching and sticking through this. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if there's anything that you want to see specifically with this topic. Like I said, this is just something that I've had a lot of fun researching, and it's really boggled my mind throughout this process, going from this is definitive proof of this theory being right and all these different measures that we had and all these different stats, but it just goes to show you just never know. If you disagree, I totally understand. If you think dead on, if you were like that theory is bullshit from the start, here you go. This is the video that you can show everyone to prove your superiority. But with that out of the way, thank you for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.